How do you see the position that the US is in when it comes to Iran? Does it seem like they truly want an end to this war, or is this just about leaving the door open for the next phase?
I think, first of all, it's truly amazing that Vance said that. He basically was telling the Iranians that, as far as the Americans are concerned, we bamboozled you with this memorandum of understanding. We tricked you. This is just going to fuel the hardliners inside of Tehran to put great pressure on the moderates who are actually negotiating this deal to back off or to get tough with the Americans. This is not in our interest for him to say this, even if he believes it. Furthermore, I think what's going on here is that he's playing to American public opinion. The argument is that we lost the war, that the Memorandum of Understanding is a surrender document, which it is. And what he's saying is, don't believe that. What we really did here was bamboozle the Iranians. So I think this is mainly for domestic political purposes. Now, the question is what's going on? Trump and Vance and others in the administration, and even the hawks outside the administration, like to talk as if we have a military option down the road. In other words, we can go back to the bombing campaign. Nobody's talking about putting boots on the ground, and they're not talking about restarting the blockade. What they're talking about is a new bombing campaign. This is not a viable option. We stopped the bombing campaign on April 8th. Very important to understand that. The bombing campaign went from February 28th to April 8th. It stopped. And we have never seriously thought about restarting it, despite all the hot rhetoric in this regard from President Trump and others, because it wouldn't work. That's why we stopped it on April 8th. The idea that we can restart the bombing campaign and win, no way. What you want to remember here is that the Memorandum of Understanding has two big parts to it. The first part, which involved signing the document and making some initial moves, was mainly concerned with opening the strait and allowing Iran, in fact, to ship oil through the Strait of Hormuz. There's a lot of talk about ending the fighting between Iran and the United States, but for all intents and purposes, that fighting ended on April 8th. There was no major war going on between the United States and Iran. So all this talk about ending the war with the Memorandum of Understanding is not of real relevance. What's of real relevance is that we wanted to open the strait because we got to get all of the oil we can out into global markets because we want to avoid a Great Depression. That has by and large been accomplished with a couple glitches along the way. But the strait is basically opened, and it will open even further in the weeks ahead in all likelihood. That's the first part of the Memorandum of Understanding. But what people don't seem to understand is that there's a second phase here, which has to do with the negotiations that are supposed to be going on now, but are really not going on now. And that involves the nuclear issue. The nuclear issue is of enormous importance. That has to be negotiated. Furthermore, there are four big economic issues involving the Iranians that have to be negotiated. One is whether the Iranians are going to be able to charge tolls in the strait. Number two, what about reparations? What about this $300 billion fund for reparations that's described in the MOU? Furthermore, what about full sanctions relief, which is discussed in the MOU? And what about the release of probably about $100 billion in frozen Iranian assets? These issues all have to be resolved, these four economic issues, as well as the nuclear issue. So if you think about it, Rachel, what's happened here is we've opened the strait for all intents and purposes, and that will do a lot to help the international economy. And moreover, there's no serious threat at the moment of the air war restarting. I don't think the MOU made much difference in that regard, but let's assume I'm wrong and it did. Anyway, the air war is stopped, the strait is open. Okay, but then we have all these other issues that have to be dealt with. And the idea that we're going to play hardball with the Iranians and they're going to throw up their hands and agree to what we want on the nuclear issue, and then we're going to play hardball with the Iranians and not give them anything in terms of those four big economic issues I described, I would not bet any money on that, right? We may try to play hardball, but the Iranians will play hardball themselves, and we will not get any nuclear deal. And that will be disastrous for us because we need some sort of version of the JCPOA. And that's why we're likely to cave on a lot of those economic issues that I just described to you. Those four economic issues, I think we'll cave on most of them, if not all of them, because that will be necessary to get the nuclear deal. And the nuclear deal is the second big goal that we have. The first big goal was opening the straits. That's done for the time being. And the second big goal is the nuclear deal. And my final point to you is, for those people who say what we ought to do is go back to bombing, you know what'll happen if we go back to bombing? Not only will we not get a nuclear deal, but the strait will be reshut. And then we'll be back to square one.
Exactly. That was a really good explanation of really just the scenario that we're in, where you look at the US and just as you were saying, Iran is in this position of like, okay, you're going to go back to bombing us? Okay. While at the same time knowing that they have so much leverage. I mean, if the US goes back to bombing, Iran can still hit all of the US allies in the Persian Gulf, hit more military bases. They can close the Bab el-Mandab Strait. They can make the global economy scream, and it can be so much worse than it was before. And so when it comes to the economy, because kind of like you were saying, we haven't felt the real impact of this last phase of the war just yet. We've kind of been skating on by and just waiting on pins and needles to see, is this going to get worse? Is it going to get better? Do you have any major concerns about the economy right now and kind of where we're headed, especially as this standoff continues and as there is still a threat that the Strait of Hormuz could be closed, or that some of the damage that was done during this war won't be repaired anytime soon?
Well, I think that there is no question that damage has been done, and that damage has not fully played itself out yet. As you said, it's going to take some time to get oil facilities in the Gulf up to speed, because so many of them have been damaged, and to get oil flowing out of the Gulf at the rates that it was flowing out on February 27th. It's going to take some time. The other thing is that there are going to be residual effects of what's happened already. For example, food, all those fertilizers that didn't come out in the spring and therefore limited the planting season. And we're going to have higher food prices as a result of what's going on in the fall and in the winter, and this is going to contribute to inflation. So the costs, the economic costs of what's happened so far are going to be significant moving forward. But it looks like we're not going to have a Great Depression, thankfully, that now that the strait is opened, we can do significant damage limitation. And of course, President Trump has a great incentive, as does every leader around the world, to limit the damage from what has been done already. So I think we will not go off a cliff. But as you were pointing out, if we go back to a bombing campaign, then that scenario is resurrected, and the danger of going off a cliff is very real.
Especially after all of the damage they just did. And then it's like, do you want to deal with those consequences? Because we can definitely make that happen. And it'll be interesting to see what the Trump administration decides. Now, I did also want to get into the Lebanon-Israel issue here, because I know that that was another aspect that even was mentioned in the MOU. You've had the U.S. repeatedly now promise the ceasefire will extend to Lebanon, and then Netanyahu comes out and declares that that's not going to be the case, that Israel is not going to pull back troops. Clearly, they're not going to stop bombing because they've continued to carry out strikes, wiping out entire Lebanese villages in the south. And so, when it comes to the role that Israel plays here, how do you see it? Is there a world where the U.S. reins them in and we have a little bit of peace? Or is Israel, and will they continue to play the spoiler for any deal that is made?
A lot of points here. First of all, Israel definitely wants to play the spoiler, and it understands that Lebanon helps it in that regard. No doubt about that. And furthermore, the Israelis definitely don't want a situation where Iran has a veto over what they can do in Lebanon. And so, independent of the Iran war itself and the deal itself, they just do not want a situation where they're not free to intervene in Lebanon whenever they see the need. So it's just very important to keep those things in mind. Look, it's very hard to say how this plays out, but let me take you down a couple roads. One is that Ghalibaf, who is the Speaker of the Parliament in Iran and is the lead negotiator with the Americans regarding the Memorandum of Understanding, Ghalibaf has said, according to a series of different reports, that there will be no direct negotiations between the United States and Iran until Israel pulls out of southern Lebanon. He said that. And there are no direct negotiations. To the extent that negotiations are now taking place, they're indirect. And you just have to say to yourself, if the Iranians really are serious about that, and there are no direct negotiations until Israel pulls out of southern Lebanon, then we're never going to get to the nuclear issue. We're never going to get to those economic issues. This one is not going to be solved. So that's a really big issue to think about. And then there's the whole question of what happens if the Iranians are willing to talk, even though willing to engage in direct talks, even though the Israelis remain in southern Lebanon. And we get to the nuclear issue. And the Iranians are driving a hard bargain. And it looks like we're close to a deal, something like a new JCPOA. But then the Iranians say, we're willing to sign this deal. We're not wildly enthusiastic about it, but we're willing to sign it. But we're not going to sign it until Israel pulls out of southern Lebanon. Now, you know the Israelis want the nuclear deal, right? They want the nuclear deal. We want the nuclear deal too, but the Israelis really want the nuclear deal at this point because they don't want Iran to end up with a nuclear weapon. So here you are, you're close to JCPOA 2, but the only way the Iranians will cave is if the Israelis pull out of southern Lebanon. What are they going to do then? All of this is to say it's very hard to see how this one plays itself out moving forward. But I before said to you, Rachel, that you want to think about the nuclear dimension and these four economic dimensions moving forward. What you have done is you've introduced the Lebanon issue. So the Lebanon issue, the nuclear issue, and then the four big economic issues. These are all intertwined. And to get ourselves out of this war and to get some sort of meaningful settlement, where you have some reasonable level of stability in the Gulf, I think you have to deal with all of these issues. And doing that is going to be very difficult. And again, just to repeat a point you've made and I've made, is if you go back to bombing, right, that ruins the first part of the deal that we got, which is the strait is open. And that would be catastrophic. So as you see, we are playing a very weak hand here. We lost this war. The Memorandum of Understanding is a surrender document. President Trump and Vice President Vance can try and put lipstick on the pig, but it is what it is. And moving forward, it is going to be very difficult for us unless we're willing to just make all sorts of concessions to the Iranians to get a nuclear deal and a relatively stable environment in the Gulf.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and exactly as you described it, I want to add one more issue to that, which is kind of the position of US foreign policy. And like you were saying about the US being in this weak position, because I guess tying it all together, right? Having this war in Ukraine where you have Russia on the move on the ground and not much the US can do. I mean, I guess they can send a few more missiles. It's not going to change the balance of power. Then you have Iran over here negotiating from a place of strength and the US desperate to have some sort of a nuclear deal and really in a position of, okay, do we give the Iranians whatever they want in order to get this deal and get Trump to make it look like he's declared some sort of victory? Where does that leave US foreign policy and truly the power that the US has, or the ability, I guess I should say, to be able to project power across the world?
I think the situation you described with regard to Europe/Ukraine on one hand and the Gulf/Iran on the other hand basically says that we are playing a very weak hand. We are in a very important way in a weak position. We're on the losing side, in effect, in both the Gulf and in Ukraine. No question about it. And by the way, if you throw in East Asia and you throw in the whole matter of containing China, as a result of this fiasco in the Iran, called the Iran War, and as a result of what's going on in Ukraine, and the fact that Trump seems to have grown new enthusiasm for Ukraine, we're in a weak position in East Asia. As I like to say, we were pivoting to Asia for a long period of time. And since the Iran war started, we've been pivoting away from East Asia. So we're in a very important way in trouble in East Asia. We promised to sell the Japanese Tomahawks. We told them we don't have the Tomahawks to sell them at this point. We're shortchanging the weaponry we're giving to the Taiwanese. We've weakened ourselves in East Asia. And as you were describing, and I'm agreeing with you, we're in real trouble in the Gulf and in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's crazy to watch this all play out at once, but I guess it was coming to this point with the US trying to play all of these different wars at once, and yet they're still over here preparing for war with China, or maybe some of the hawks in the administration are. The last thing I'll mention here, when it comes to the future of US versus China tensions, and kind of like you were saying about the US being in this weak spot. Do you think that that will deter the US at all from trying to really go after China, or should we expect a year or two down the road they're trying to revamp up their East Asia campaign ready to take on Beijing?
Well, I think it's very important to emphasize that the United States is not interested in going to war against China, taking on China by initiating some sort of conflict. I think we basically have a containment strategy. We want to prevent China from taking Taiwan, from controlling the South China Sea, and from controlling the East China Sea. It's really a deterrence policy. I think we fully understand that China is remarkably powerful, and the last thing you want to do is get into a war with China, certainly at this point in time. So I don't see our behavior at the military level as very provocative in East Asia. Where the competition is really intense and really wicked, and where we want to run the Chinese off the table and they want to run us off the table, is at the economic level, and more specifically in terms of sophisticated technologies, AI, quantum computing, and so forth and so on. So that's where we're trying to roll back the Chinese. I think in terms of the military competition, it's mainly containment, not rollback. But in terms of the economic competition, it's rollback. And that competition is certainly going to be fierce moving forward. And I've long argued that at the military level, the competition will become increasingly fierce as well, because the Chinese are bent on taking Taiwan back. And they also believe that the South China Sea and the East China Sea are two giant Chinese lakes, not international waters. They kind of view the South China Sea the way Iran views the Strait of Hormuz, and we don't agree in either case. And in East Asia, this could be a big problem moving forward. So the fact is that you and I are going to be talking about these issues for a long time to come.
They never give us any shortage of things to talk about, do they? Well, I know that there is certainly a lot at stake here all around, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. John Mearsheimer, an author, international relations expert, and professor at the University of Chicago, thank you so much for your time and insight.
You're welcome, Rachel.